The mall was alive with noise. Shoppers walked past bright store windows. Children pulled their parents toward toy shops, and food courts filled the air with the smell of fried food and coffee. It was just another busy afternoon. Yet among the thousands of people moving through the mall, one man was not there to shop or to eat. He was there to disappear. His name was Daniel Warren. On paper, he was one of the wealthiest men in the country. His companies owned malls, hotels, and skyscrapers that stretched across cities. His face appeared in business magazines, and television anchors often called him one of the most powerful men of his generation. But today he was not dressed in a tailored suit, and there was no security detail following behind him. Today he wore an old hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. Daniel wanted to see the world with his own eyes, not the polished view his assistants prepared for him, but the raw, ordinary life inside his mall. For years he had read reports about customer satisfaction, employee efficiency, and profit margins, but deep inside he felt a strange emptiness. He had built an empire but could not remember the last time he had spoken to one of the people who scrubbed his floors or stocked his shelves. As he walked slowly down the corridor, he blended easily with the crowd. No one recognized him. That was how he preferred it. He wanted to hear the real conversations, to see the tired faces, to understand how life truly felt inside his business. Every so often he paused near the food court or leaned against a railing to simply watch. There was a strange comfort in being invisible. He turned down a quieter hallway, away from the noise of shoppers. This corridor led to the maintenance rooms and staff storage areas, places most customers never saw. The hum of the mall faded, replaced by the distant echo of cleaning carts being pushed and the metallic rattle of supply closets opening and closing. That was when he heard it. It was faint at first, like a muffled sound behind a closed door. He slowed his steps, his head tilting slightly. It was not the usual noise of work. It was something more fragile, something raw. As he drew closer, the sound became clearer. Soft, broken sobs, the kind of crying someone tries to hide but cannot contain. Daniel froze. His instinct was to walk away. He was, after all, a stranger in the eyes of the workers here. But something in the tone of that crying stopped him. It was not just sadness. It carried exhaustion, as if the person had been carrying too much for too long. He hesitated, then followed the sound. He found himself standing at the door of a small supply room. Inside, the shelves were lined with bottles of cleaning chemicals, stacks of paper towels, and neatly arranged sprays. But in the middle of this cramped space, sitting on a metal chair, was a woman in a brown uniform. Her head was bent low, her hand pressed against her forehead as if she were holding it together by sheer force. In her other hand, she clutched a piece of paper. Tears rolled down her cheeks, leaving dark lines against her skin. Daniel stood quietly at the doorway, unsure of what to do. The woman had not noticed him yet. He watched her shoulders tremble as she struggled to breathe through her tears. The sight struck him harder than he expected. This was not just an employee. This was a human being, breaking apart in the shadows of a room that smelled of bleach and detergent. Finally, he stepped forward. His voice was gentle, almost uncertain. "Excuse me," he said softly. The woman startled, quickly wiping at her face. Her eyes darted up wide and filled with fear, as if she had been caught doing something wrong. She tried to hide the paper in her lap, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll get back to work. Please don't report me." Her words hit him like a weight. She was not worried about her tears. She was worried about losing her job. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, he replied. "I'm not here to report you. I heard you crying. Are you all right?" For a moment, silence filled the small room. The woman looked at him carefully, her expression tense, guarded. It was clear she did not trust easily. After all, she had no idea who he really was. To her, he was just a man in ordinary clothes. She finally sighed and lowered her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "It's nothing, just life." Daniel pulled a second chair closer and sat down, leaving a respectful distance. His voice remained calm, steady. "Sometimes life gets heavy," he said. "If you need someone to listen, I can stay for a few minutes." No judgment, just a person who wants to listen. The woman hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak but closing again. She seemed to battle with herself, torn between silence and release. Finally, her shoulders dropped and she let out a shaky breath. "My name is Amina. she said quietly. "I've worked here for 6 years. I've never missed a shift, but—" Her voice cracked, and she looked down at the paper in her hand. "My son is sick. He needs treatment, and the hospital wants money I don't have. I've been working extra shifts, but it's not enough. Every time I think I'm catching up, another bill comes and I fall behind again." Daniel listened in silence, his chest tightening with every word. He watched the way her fingers clenched the paper as if holding onto it could change the numbers written on it. He saw the lines of fatigue under her eyes, the way her uniform was neat but worn. "I try to be strong for him," Amina continued, "but yesterday the doctor said if I don't make the payment soon, they won't continue the treatment. I came here today and all I could think was, how do I choose between food, rent, and saving my child's life? And I just—" Her voice broke and she covered her face with her hands. "I just couldn't hold it in anymore." The room was silent except for her sobs. Daniel felt something stir inside him, something he had not felt in years. Guilt, anger, helplessness. He had always thought success was measured in numbers, but sitting across from Amina, success felt meaningless. What good was a fortune if people in his own mall were breaking under the weight of poverty? He wanted to tell her who he was, to promise her that everything would change. But he held back. This was not the time for grand reveals. This was the time to listen, to see her pain, to understand it. So he stayed. For the first time in a long time, Daniel Warren sat in silence, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a human being, face to face with the reality he had ignored for too long. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the wide glass panels of the mall, filling the space with warmth and life. People came in with shopping bags, children laughed, and workers carried out their routines with quiet determination. Yet hidden behind the polished floors and sparkling storefronts, one life was trembling on the edge of breaking. Amina walked in through the staff entrance with heavy steps, her brown uniform freshly pressed but her eyes carrying the shadows of another sleepless night. She held her cleaning cart in one hand, forcing herself to smile faintly at her coworkers before pushing it down the hallway. No one knew what was going on in her heart. She was a master at hiding it. But inside, every breath felt like carrying a mountain. The paper in her pocket weighed more than bricks. It was the hospital bill that had made her collapse in tears the day before. She had folded it carefully and tucked it away. But no matter how far she pushed it into her pocket, it stayed loud in her mind. Every number on that page screamed a truth she could not escape. Her son's treatment cost more than she made in an entire year. She tried to tell herself that she would find a way, that she always had. But her strength was thinning. For 6 years she had given everything to this job, scrubbing bathrooms, polishing windows, working holidays when everyone else was with family. And yet when she needed help, she felt invisible. She reached the supply closet, the same place where she had broken down yesterday. For a moment her hand froze on the handle. She remembered the stranger, the man in simple clothes who had walked in on her crying. His words still echoed faintly in her head. "Sometimes life gets heavy. If you need someone to listen, I can stay." His kindness had startled her. She did not expect kindness from anyone anymore. And yet there was something in his eyes, a quiet sincerity that had reached her in the darkest moment. She wondered who he was. Maybe just a kind passerby. Maybe a worker from another department. Whoever he was, she had been grateful that someone had listened. Little did she know that man was walking the mall again that morning. Daniel had not been able to forget her face. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, haunted by the image of her tears. He had built skyscrapers, signed billion-dollar deals, and expanded into countries across the world. But not once had he felt as shaken as he did when he heard the despair in her voice. It was a feeling he could not shake, a truth pressing at his chest, telling him that success meant nothing if the people at the bottom of his empire were drowning in silence. He moved quietly through the mall, blending in as he had before. He wore the same hoodie and jeans, no one giving him a second glance. But today his steps had a new purpose. He was not only there to observe, he was there to understand more, to see deeper. He noticed her again near the central fountain, wiping the tiles on the floor with slow, steady strokes. Her movements were practiced, almost automatic, but her eyes seemed distant. Daniel stood at a distance watching for a moment. He saw how customers walked past her without even noticing her, how children splashed water nearby while she patiently cleaned after them, how she became part of the background like furniture instead of a person. He wondered how many times he himself had walked past people like her without a second thought. That realization hurt. After a while, he approached, careful not to startle her. "Good morning," he said softly. Amina looked up, surprised to see him again. Her eyes widened slightly before narrowing in suspicion. "You again," she said quietly. "What are you doing here?" Daniel gave a faint smile. "Just walking, watching, trying to see things I usually miss." She blinked, clearly confused by his words. "Most people don't come to this part of the mall to watch," she replied almost dryly. "Most people don't see what matters," he said. "Yesterday I saw someone who mattered. And today I wanted to see if she was all right." Her lips parted slightly, caught off guard by the gentleness in his voice. She shook her head, looking down at the floor. "I told you I'm fine. I have work to do. Please don't waste your time on me." But Daniel did not leave. Instead, he crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "If you were fine, you wouldn't be crying alone in a supply room," he said quietly. "You don't have to tell me everything, just don't lie to yourself about being fine." The words slipped into her heart before she could guard against them. For a moment, her jaw tightened as if she wanted to argue, but instead she let out a long, weary sigh. She leaned against the mop handle, her shoulders sagging. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can't. I've been working so hard for so long, and still I can't save him. My son is only 8. He wants to play soccer, he wants to laugh, he wants to grow up. And I can't even give him that chance. Do you know what it's like to feel like you're failing your own child?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. He did not know. He had no children, no family that depended on him in that way. His empire had always shielded him from such raw fear, but sitting there, listening to her, he felt her pain press into his chest as if it were his own. He wanted to reach out to promise her everything would be all right, but he kept himself still. This was her truth, and it deserved silence more than promises. Around them, the mall carried on. Shoppers moved past, a child laughed nearby, an announcement echoed over the speakers. Yet in that small corner near the fountain, it felt like the world had gone quiet, leaving only 2 people and a secret too heavy for one of them to carry alone. After a long pause, Daniel asked softly, "What's his name?" Amina's eyes lifted slowly, shimmering with unshed tears. "Jamal," she whispered. "His name is Jamal." Daniel nodded, repeating it in his mind. Jamal, a child he had never met, yet whose life now burned into his conscience like a mark. "Tell me about him," he said gently, and so she did. Her voice trembled at first, but then warmed with love as she spoke. She told him about Jamal's bright smile, about how he loved to draw airplanes and dreamed of being a pilot someday. She told him about the nights he woke up coughing, the endless hospital visits, and how she always tried to be strong for him even when her heart felt like breaking. As she spoke, Daniel could almost see the boy in front of him, could almost hear the laughter she described. And the thought of that laughter fading because of something as cruel as money made his stomach twist. By the time she fell silent, her hands were shaking. She quickly turned away, embarrassed by how much she had revealed. "I shouldn't have said all that," she murmured. "You're just a stranger. What good does it do to tell you?" But Daniel shook his head. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "a stranger sees you more clearly than anyone else." Her eyes flickered to his, uncertain, then dropped again. She returned to her work, pushing the mop slowly across the tiles, but Daniel stayed nearby, leaning against the railing, lost in thought. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, and yet at the same time he felt alive. Listening to her, seeing her pain, reminded him of something he had forgotten, that beneath all the wealth and numbers, life was about people. Real people. That night, as he left the mall, Daniel could not stop thinking of Jamal. The name repeated in his mind like a quiet drumbeat. Jamal deserved a chance. Amina deserved hope. And Daniel knew that soon, very soon, he would have to stop hiding behind his disguise and use the power he had been blessed with. But not yet. First, he needed to see more. First, he needed to understand the full truth of how his empire treated the people at its heart. And so, as the mall lights dimmed and the crowds thinned, the undercover CEO walked out into the night with a heavy heart and a silent promise burning inside him. He did not yet know how, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end of Amina's story. It was only the beginning. The mall looked brighter than usual the following day. But for Amina, the light did nothing to ease the storm inside her. She had woken up before sunrise, preparing Jamal's medicine, leaving him with her neighbor and rushing to catch the early bus. Her body moved on routine, yet her mind was drowning in fear. The doctor's words from 2 days ago echoed like a drumbeat she could not silence. Without the payment, we cannot continue the treatment. Those words cut deeper than any insult, deeper than any pain her own body had endured. It was a sentence, a countdown, and every second of every day reminded her that she was running out of time. She walked into the mall with her cleaning cart, forcing her face into calmness because that was what the world demanded of her. Customers did not want to see her pain. Managers did not want to hear her excuses, and life did not pause simply because she was breaking. Daniel had returned too. He moved quietly among the shoppers just as he had before. His disguise was simple, but his mind was more restless than ever. He had barely slept the night before, replaying Amina's words again and again. The way she described Jamal, the way her voice broke when she said she might lose him, it had carved into him something he could not ignore. He had spent years building a business that looked perfect from the outside. Glass walls, shining floors, rows of happy customers. Yet here was one of his workers giving every hour of her strength and still unable to hold her own life together. It was not just unfair. It was wrong. He walked through the hallways, watching people pass her by as if she did not exist. She was wiping down the railing near the escalator, her hands moving in slow circles. Most people never even made eye contact. A child brushed past her cart, nearly tipping a bottle of cleaner, but the parents pulled the child away without a word of thanks. Daniel's chest tightened. He had lived long enough in a world where people noticed him everywhere he went. Reporters, investors, politicians, they all fought for his attention. But Amina lived in a world where she was invisible, even while she was holding the very place together. He approached her again. She noticed him this time, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of suspicion and weariness. "You again," she murmured, shaking her head. "Why do you keep following me?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm not following. I'm learning." Her brow furrowed. "Learning what? That I mop floors and clean trash cans? That I smile at people who never see me? Learning that someone strong can still carry too much," Daniel said softly. "Learning that even the people who seem invisible are carrying stories that matter." Her lips pressed tightly together. She wanted to push him away, to tell him that his words were nothing but comfort she could not afford. But something in his tone made her pause. It was not pity. It was not fake kindness. It was as if he truly wanted to understand. And so, with a long sigh, she set down the cloth in her hand and leaned against the railing. "You want the truth?" she asked bitterly. "The truth is worse than what you saw that day in the supply room." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then tell me." Her voice was quiet at first, almost too quiet to hear. But once she started, it was as though a dam had broken. She told him about Jamal's illness, how it had started with small fevers and coughs, and how doctors had said it was nothing serious. She told him about the night she rushed him to the hospital when he could not breathe, how she had stood in the emergency room praying for his life. She told him about the bills, about how she sold everything she owned worth selling, about how she worked more hours than her body could bear, all to keep him alive. "And still," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears, "it is not enough. I bring home my paycheck and it disappears the same day. Rent, food, medicine, there is nothing left. Do you know what it feels like to look at your child and know you cannot save him?" Daniel's throat tightened. He had never known that feeling, but in that moment he felt as if he could. He could almost see Jamal's small frame, almost hear the cough that kept him awake at night. He imagined being powerless, watching someone you loved fade while the world around you kept spinning, blind to your pain. Amina wiped her tears roughly with the back of her hand, her voice hardening. "I've given this mall 6 years of my life. I've cleaned every corner, every bathroom, every floor, and yet I cannot even afford to save my own child. That is the truth. And it hurts more than anything." Silence stretched between them. The noise of the mall seemed far away, like a distant hum. Daniel stood there, feeling the weight of her words crush down on him. He wanted to speak, to promise her that she would never struggle again, but he held back. If he revealed himself now, she would think it was pity, a performance, another rich man's charity. No. He wanted to do this right. He wanted to not only help her, but to change the system that made her tears possible. Finally, he said quietly, "You are not failing him, Amina. You are fighting harder than anyone I've ever seen. And you are not invisible, not anymore." Her eyes flickered with something fragile, almost like hope, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. She shook her head and picked up her cloth again. "Words don't pay hospital bills," she whispered. Daniel stood there a moment longer, then slowly stepped back. She was right. Words would not save Jamal, but action could, and he knew he had the power to act. That night, as he returned to his apartment, Daniel found himself staring at his reflection in the tall windows. He saw not the billionaire CEO the world knew, but the man who had sat across from a woman breaking under the weight of poverty. He realized how little he truly understood about the people who worked for him. Reports and numbers could never tell him this. Only their voices could, and Amina's voice was now etched into his heart like a scar that would never fade. He poured himself a glass of water, but the luxury of his surroundings suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. The leather couches, the polished marble floors, the skyline view, all of it looked meaningless when he thought of a boy lying in a hospital bed, waiting for a chance at life. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something stronger than ambition. He felt responsibility. Not the kind that came with profit margins or shareholder meetings, but the kind that came with humanity. He realized the truth was worse than he had expected, and it was staring him straight in the face. One of his employees was crying alone in a supply room, crushed by a system that valued profits more than people. And unless he did something, Jamal's laughter might vanish forever. Daniel made a decision that night. He would not walk away. He would not be the kind of man who turned his back when he had the power to help. Amina's truth had become his own, and he would carry it until something changed. And so the undercover CEO closed his eyes with a heavy heart, but a new resolve. The painful truth had been revealed, and it would not let him go. The mall had always been a place Daniel viewed as a success story, a symbol of his empire's strength. Every corner of it, every store filled with goods, every advertisement lit up on the walls, it all represented profit, growth, and reputation. But now, as he walked its corridors with the weight of Amina's words in his mind, the entire place looked different. He no longer saw polished marble floors and shining storefronts. He saw weary workers wiping the glass. He saw cashiers forcing smiles even when exhaustion dragged down their eyes. And he saw janitors moving silently in the background, unnoticed, unappreciated. What used to look like triumph now looked like silence, an army of invisible lives hidden beneath the glow of wealth. Daniel moved past the fountain and paused near a railing, watching the stream of shoppers moving like waves. He could not stop thinking about the truth Amina had told him. Her story was not just about her. It was about everyone like her. How many others had hospital bills they could not pay? How many worked 2 jobs yet still chose between food and rent? He thought of his annual reports that celebrated profits in the millions, sometimes billions. And yet behind those numbers, the very people who made the business possible were living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, breath to breath. The thought left a hollow ache in his chest. For years he had told himself that he created jobs, that he gave people opportunities, but now he realized he had been blind. What good were jobs if they kept people trapped in cycles of poverty? What good were opportunities if they drained every ounce of strength from those who worked? He thought of Amina sitting in the supply room with her head in her hands. He thought of her whispering her son's name, Jamal, and he realized something he had not wanted to face. His success had cost more than money. It had cost human dignity. That night, Daniel did not return to his penthouse immediately. Instead, he drove through the streets of the city, past neighborhoods he rarely saw. He watched children playing in dimly lit alleys, parents hurrying home with groceries in tired hands, and workers trudging toward late-night buses. He wondered how many of them worked in his malls, his hotels, his businesses. He had always admired the city for its energy, but now he noticed its shadows. For the first time, he felt ashamed, not of being rich, but of being disconnected. Back in his apartment, he sat in the dark, staring at the skyline. He remembered something his father used to say when he was young. "Money builds walls, Daniel. Be careful not to live inside them." His father had been a small shop owner, a man who treated his workers like family. Daniel had admired him, but somewhere along the road to success, he had forgotten his father's wisdom. He had built walls higher than he ever imagined, walls of wealth and power, walls that kept him from seeing the suffering on the other side. And now, through Amina's tears, those walls were cracking. The following day, he walked the mall again. He watched Amina from a distance, noting how she carried herself with quiet strength despite the pain she bore. Every time she smiled faintly at a passerby, every time she picked up trash without complaint, he saw a strength that humbled him. She did not know he was watching. She did not know who he was. To her, he was just a man with questions, someone who listened for reasons she could not understand. But to him, she was no longer invisible. She was a mirror reflecting everything he needed to see. At one point, Daniel followed her quietly as she entered the food court. She carried her small lunch in a simple container, sitting in the corner away from the crowds. While others chatted and laughed, she ate quickly and silently, her eyes distant. Daniel noticed how her uniform looked clean but worn, how her shoes were frayed at the edges, how she carried herself with dignity despite the weight pressing down on her. He realized she represented hundreds of others working in his buildings, each with their own battles. Her story was unique, but the struggle was universal. He wanted to act immediately, to take out his phone and call his board of directors, to announce sweeping changes, but something held him back. This was not about making a statement. This was about making it right. If he revealed himself too soon, it might feel like charity, but he did not want charity for Amina. He wanted justice. He wanted her and people like her to live with dignity, to feel valued for the work they gave. Later that evening, he sat in his office, not the public one where assistants buzzed around, but a smaller study tucked away in the back of his penthouse. He spread out documents across his desk, payroll records, benefits packages, cost structures. Numbers filled the pages, numbers he had once been proud of, but now they felt hollow. He ran his hands over them, thinking of Amina's trembling voice. These numbers had faces. These numbers had children with names. Jamal was one of those names. The realization grew deeper with every passing hour. He had the power to change this. It would not be simple. It would mean facing resistance from investors, cutting into profits, and challenging a system that prized efficiency over compassion. But he was no longer the man he was before. He had seen too much now. He had heard too much. As midnight came, Daniel wrote down a single sentence on a blank page. If wealth does not lift others, it is nothing but weight. He stared at those words for a long time, letting them burn into his mind. He knew what he had to do. The days of watching silently were over. The next morning, when he returned to the mall, something in him had shifted. He no longer walked as an observer, but as a man with purpose. He saw Amina pushing her cart, her movement steady despite her tired eyes, and he felt a surge of determination. She still did not know who he truly was, but soon she would. And when she did, it would not just be about her. It would be about everyone like her. For the first time in years, Daniel felt that his life's direction was no longer about wealth or expansion. It was about responsibility. It was about humanity. And standing there, watching Amina wipe down the glass doors of a store while customers brushed past without seeing her, Daniel made himself a promise. He would not let her cry alone again. He would not let Jamal's laughter fade because of a number on a bill. He had the power to change everything, and now he had the reason. The realization was clear. His empire was built on the shoulders of people like Amina, and if he did not honor those shoulders, then his empire was nothing but an empty shell. That night, Daniel sat in silence once more, but this time it was not emptiness he felt. It was resolve. The walls of wealth his father had warned him about were falling, brick by brick, and through the cracks he saw something brighter than profit. He saw humanity. He saw a chance to become more than a CEO. He saw a chance to become human again, and he knew the time to reveal the truth was approaching. The city outside the mall glowed with neon lights that night, but inside Daniel's heart there was no brightness. He sat at the edge of his bed in the penthouse, his head resting in his hands, thinking about the woman whose tears he had witnessed, and the boy whose life depended on bills that seemed impossible to pay. All the wealth surrounding him, the polished marble floors, the imported furniture, the silent glass walls that overlooked the skyline, felt like a cage. For years he had thought these things meant freedom, but now he realized they only distanced him from the lives of the people who built his empire with their hands. their time, and their strength. Daniel thought about Amina's voice as she whispered her son's name, Jamal. The sound of it haunted him. He imagined an 8-year-old boy, thin from illness, eyes bright with dreams of playing soccer or flying a plane, and he imagined the fear that must fill his heart each time his mother returned late from work, hiding her exhaustion so he would not worry. The weight of that image made Daniel's chest ache in a way no financial loss ever had. He knew then that he could not go back to living as before. The encounter had changed him. He had walked into his mall as an observer, curious to see what life looked like for those who worked under him, but he had walked out with responsibility heavy on his shoulders. Yet Daniel knew he could not simply reveal himself to Amina and declare that everything was solved. That would feel like pity, like charity. He wanted more than that. He wanted a change so deep that no other worker would cry alone in a supply room. He wanted a future where people like Amina could raise their children without choosing between medicine and rent. And so he made a silent decision. He would transform his empire from the inside out, quietly at first before making his presence known. The next morning, Daniel returned to the mall once more in his plain clothes. The disguise was no longer just about hiding from the public. It had become a way of seeing clearly. He walked past the shops, past the food courts, watching the way his workers moved, how often they smiled genuinely, how often their faces seemed tired. He noticed details he had never cared about before, the way a cashier rubbed her back in pain after standing for hours, the way a security guard tried to stifle a cough while greeting customers, the way Amina's hands shook slightly when she lifted her cart. These were not just workers. These were lives quietly bearing weights heavier than most imagined. Daniel followed Amina at a distance that day. He saw her greet a fellow cleaner with a tired but genuine smile. He saw her bend to pick up a child's spilled drink without a word of complaint. He saw her pause briefly to look at her phone during her break, staring at a picture of Jamal and wipe her eyes before putting it away. It was in those small moments that Daniel understood her strength. She carried sorrow in her chest, but she never let it take her dignity. Later in the afternoon, Daniel walked into a small cafe inside the mall and sat at a corner table where he could see her as she worked. He ordered only a coffee, letting it sit untouched as his thoughts spun. He remembered the years he spent chasing power, each milestone celebrated with champagne and applause. Yet none of those victories had ever made him feel the way he felt now, sitting quietly in that cafe, watching a woman fight silently for her son's life. Success had never felt so hollow, and responsibility had never felt so urgent. When Amina passed by near the cafe with her cart, Daniel stood and stepped toward her. She glanced at him with surprise, her expression softening slightly, though guarded as always. "You again," she said, her voice quiet. Daniel nodded. "Me again, and I'll probably keep showing up." She frowned, almost amused despite herself. "Why? You don't owe me anything. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Daniel said softly. "I know your strength. I know your son's name. I know you deserve more than this silence." Her eyes shimmered, but she quickly looked away. "Words don't change anything," she murmured, echoing what she had said before. "You're right," Daniel replied. "Words don't, but actions will." She glanced at him sharply, confused by the certainty in his voice. But before she could ask what he meant, he smiled faintly and stepped back. He knew it was not time yet. Not until he had everything prepared. That night, Daniel returned to his office tower. He summoned his closest advisors, but not under his title of CEO. He asked them for anonymous reports about employee living conditions, healthcare coverage, and wages across his businesses. He did not tell them why, only that he needed the truth without polish, without filters. He read through pages of data late into the night, his heart sinking with each line. The reports confirmed what Amina had shown him. Wages barely covering survival, benefits too small to meet medical needs, and countless workers living in constant fear of emergencies they could not afford. As dawn broke, Daniel sat with the report spread across his desk, his head bowed. He thought of his father again, the man who once said, "A leader's strength is not measured by how many serve him, but by how many he lifts." Daniel realized how far he had strayed from that wisdom. But he also realized it was not too late to return. His silent decision grew clearer. He would restructure wages across his companies. He would expand healthcare coverage. He would create emergency funds for families in crisis. These changes would not happen overnight, and they would not come without cost. Investors would fight, profits would dip, and critics would argue. But Daniel no longer cared. The image of Amina crying in the supply room had burned away his fear of criticism. The only fear that remained was failing to act while people like her suffered in silence. For now, he kept his decision close to his chest. He continued visiting the mall, continued blending in with the crowd, continued watching Amina. He noticed how she began to expect his presence, how her suspicion slowly softened into reluctant trust. She did not ask who he was anymore. Perhaps she had accepted that he was simply a stranger who cared. And maybe in that acceptance she found a small sliver of comfort. Daniel did not push for more. He let her keep her dignity, let her carry her strength. But inside he carried a fire. Soon he would reveal himself. Soon she would know that her tears had not been wasted in silence. Soon Jamal would have the chance he deserved. Until then, Daniel's decision remained unspoken but unshakable. He had entered the mall as a billionaire disguised in plain clothes. He would leave as a man ready to break down the walls his wealth had built. And as he closed his eyes that night, he whispered to himself the promise that had now become his guiding truth. I will not let her fight alone. The mall was busy again that morning, filled with footsteps, voices, and the endless rhythm of commerce. To most, it was just another day. Customers hurried to shops, children begged for toys, workers went about their tasks unnoticed. But for Amina, each day had begun to feel heavier, as though the world was balancing on her shoulders. She pushed her cart slowly down the corridor, her mind half in the mall and half at the hospital where Jamal lay in bed. She thought of his face, his smile that was growing weaker, the dreams he still whispered to her about becoming a pilot. She carried those dreams like a fragile flame, desperate not to let it die out. She had grown accustomed to seeing the quiet stranger in the mall by now. He would appear suddenly, sometimes near the fountain, sometimes in the food court, sometimes simply walking past with thoughtful eyes. At first, she had thought he was strange, even suspicious. But over time, she realized he was different. He listened. He did not judge her or dismiss her pain. He was simply there, and somehow that steadiness had brought her a strange comfort. She never asked who he was. In her mind, he was just a kind man who cared enough to see her when others looked past her. She did not expect more than that. But this day was different. Daniel had prepared himself for this moment, though his heart carried the weight of uncertainty. For weeks he had walked the mall as a stranger, listening and learning. For weeks he had carried her story in silence, letting it reshape everything he thought he knew about his empire and his life. But silence could not last forever. The time had come to reveal the truth, not just to her but to himself. He could not remain in disguise while her world was crumbling. It was time to step out from the shadows he had built. That morning, Daniel did not come in wearing his faded hoodie and sneakers. He arrived in a tailored suit, the kind the world expected of him. His posture carried the weight of leadership, his steps quiet but firm. People glanced at him as he walked through the mall, some recognizing him immediately. Whispers spread quickly among employees and managers. The CEO was here, the billionaire himself. For many, his presence was unimaginable. For Daniel, it was necessary. He asked to meet the mall's staff in the central hall. Managers rushed to gather everyone, uncertain why the owner himself had come without warning. Workers murmured in surprise, cleaners left their carts in corners, and security guards looked at each other nervously. Amina, confused, followed the crowd into the hall. She stood among her co-workers, her uniform marked with the faint scent of cleaning supplies, her hands folded nervously as she watched. When Daniel stepped onto the small platform, silence fell. His eyes scanned the crowd, but they stopped when they found her. Amina froze, her heart pounding. The kind stranger she had spoken to, the man who had listened to her tears, was standing before her in a suit. Recognition swept over her like a wave. Her knees almost gave way as realization struck. He was not a stranger at all. He was the man whose name she had heard whispered in the news. The man who owned this very mall. The undercover CEO. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Confusion, shock, and fear tangled inside her. She wanted to look away, but could not. Daniel took a deep breath and began to speak. I have built many things in my life, he said, his voice calm but filled with weight. Skyscrapers, hotels, malls. People look at these buildings and call them success. But I have learned that walls of glass and marble mean nothing if the people who keep them standing are breaking inside. The workers shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this was leading. Amina stood frozen, her heart pounding louder than his words. Daniel continued, his eyes still locked on her. Not long ago I walked through this mall in silence, without a suit, without a name. I wanted to see with my own eyes, to hear with my own ears, and what I found was a truth I cannot ignore. I found strength. I found dignity. But I also found pain that no one should bear alone. The hall was quiet. Every worker, every manager, every guard listened. Daniel's voice grew softer, almost personal. I met someone among you, someone who works harder than most can imagine, someone who carries not only the weight of this mall but the weight of her child's life. And through her I realized how blind I had been. I realized that success means nothing if the people who build it suffer in silence. Amina's eyes blurred with tears. She wanted to run, to hide, but she could not move. Everyone around her began to look at her as Daniel's words painted the truth she had tried so hard to conceal. Shame and fear flooded her, but beneath it all something else stirred. Hope. Daniel took another breath. From this day forward, things will change. Wages will rise. Healthcare will be expanded. Emergency funds will be created so that no family must choose between survival and dignity. And to the woman who taught me this truth, your son's treatment will be paid in full. Not as charity, but as justice. Because you and every person here matter more than profit. You are the heart of this empire, and without you it is nothing. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs spread quickly, disbelief and relief mixing together. Some workers wiped their eyes. Others clutched each other's hands. Managers stood frozen, unsure how to react. And in the center of it all, Amina's knees buckled as tears poured freely down her face. She pressed her hands to her mouth, trembling. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but no words came. Instead, she shook with relief, with the release of a burden she had carried too long. Jamal would live. Her son's laughter would not fade. For the first time in years, she felt the weight lift, and in its place came hope. Daniel stepped down from the platform and walked toward her. The crowd parted silently, watching. He stopped in front of her, his eyes steady, his voice gentle. You are not invisible, Amina. You never were. And you never will be again. Her tears fell harder. She nodded slowly, unable to form words, but in her eyes he saw gratitude deeper than any thank you. Around them, the workers clapped softly, some openly crying, some holding each other. The sound grew until it filled the hall with warmth, stronger than any applause Daniel had ever received in his life. At that moment, he felt something he had not felt in years. Not pride, not triumph, but humanity. He was not just a CEO, not just a billionaire. He was a man who had finally remembered what his father taught him. Money should never build walls. It should build bridges. And in that crowded mall, filled with ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens, Daniel realized he had crossed the most important bridge of his life. The reveal was complete. The stranger was gone. The man stood revealed, not just to Amina, but to himself. The days that followed the reveal were unlike anything Amina had ever known. For years she had moved through the mall quietly, unseen, her footsteps echoing in hallways that swallowed her existence. She had taught herself to accept invisibility, to live with the weight of silence and hardship. But now, everywhere she walked, heads turned. Her co-workers looked at her with new eyes, some filled with awe, others with quiet gratitude. To them, she was no longer just a cleaner in a brown uniform. She was the reason the billionaire CEO had stood before them and promised change. She was proof that one voice, one truth, could shake walls that had stood unchallenged for years. Yet Amina carried herself as humbly as before. She still pushed her cart, still wiped the floors, still worked with the same diligence. But inside her heart was different. She no longer walked with the same crushing weight on her shoulders. She no longer carried fear in her pocket alongside hospital bills. The call from the hospital had come the very next morning. Jamal's treatment had been cleared, the doctors assured her, and they could begin immediately without delay. The relief that washed through her body was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had cried until she could no longer cry, holding Jamal's small hands as he smiled weakly at her, whispering that he wanted to play outside again soon. That hope in his voice was worth more than every paycheck she had ever earned. For Daniel, the days after the reveal were equally transformative. The world knew him as a man of wealth, of business, of numbers and deals. But now the headlines told a different story. Reporters filled newspapers and television screens with his unexpected speech at the mall, calling it unprecedented. Some praised him as a visionary, others dismissed him as reckless. Investors worried about profit losses. Analysts questioned his strategy, but Daniel no longer cared for their judgment. For the first time, he felt his decisions were not about building higher walls of success, but about breaking them down. He attended board meetings with a new fire in his voice, declaring that wages would rise across all his businesses, that healthcare would be expanded for every worker, that emergency relief funds would be permanent. His advisors shifted uncomfortably, some protesting, but Daniel stood firm. He reminded them that wealth without humanity was nothing but dust. In the mall, changes came quickly. Posters were put up announcing new policies. Staff meetings were held to explain benefits that workers had never dreamed of receiving. For the first time, employees felt they were not invisible cogs in a vast machine, but vital parts of a living system that finally valued them. The atmosphere shifted. Smiles were real. Laughter returned to break rooms, and workers spoke to each other with renewed pride. Amina noticed it all, and each time she heard a coworker whisper, "Can you believe it? Things are really changing." She felt her chest swell with quiet joy. One afternoon, Daniel returned to the mall again. This time, he did not disguise himself. He walked openly, shaking hands with workers, greeting security guards by name, asking cashiers about their families. For many, it felt surreal to see the billionaire CEO walking among them like an equal. But Daniel knew it was no longer about appearances. It was about presence. It was about being seen and seeing others in return. When he reached the fountain, he found Amina cleaning its edge as usual. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment the noise of the mall faded. He walked toward her, his voice gentle. "How is Jamal?" Her lips curved into a trembling smile. "He's better. He's laughing again. The doctors say he's responding well." Her eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide this time. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved his life." Daniel shook his head. "No, you saved his life. You carried him when no one else did. I only did what I should have done all along." She lowered her gaze, humbled, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. For so long she had thought of herself as powerless. Now she realized her courage, her honesty had moved mountains. She had not only saved her son, she had helped change the lives of countless others. As weeks turned to months, the transformation spread. Other business owners took notice, some reluctantly adjusting their policies to compete, others inspired by Daniel's vision. Workers across the city began to believe in something they had forgotten: dignity. For Amina, life was still not easy. She still woke up early, still worked long hours. But now, when she walked into the mall, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen. She felt valued. Jamal grew stronger with each passing week. Slowly, his cough faded, his energy returned, and soon he was playing soccer with neighborhood children, his laughter echoing through the streets. Each time Amina watched him run, she thought of the stranger who had once sat quietly in a supply room, listening to her tears. That moment, born of pain, had become the turning point of her life. For Daniel, the change was even deeper. He no longer looked at his empire with pride alone. He looked at it with humility, with responsibility. Each building, each business was not just a monument to his ambition, but a home to thousands of lives. And he carried those lives with him in every decision. He continued to walk his malls without disguise, sometimes in his suit, sometimes still in simple clothes, always searching for the stories hidden in plain sight. He had learned a truth he would never forget. Leadership was not about being served, but about serving. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the mall lights flickered on, Daniel stood by the fountain once more. Amina passed by, her cart rattling softly, and she paused to meet his eyes. For a moment they exchanged a quiet smile, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had changed. There were no words needed. Between them was an understanding deeper than gratitude or charity. It was the bond of two lives that had collided by chance and reshaped each other forever. Daniel turned his gaze upward to the high glass ceiling, the reflections of lights shimmering against the night sky. For the first time, he did not see wealth in its shine. He saw hope. He saw humanity. And he whispered to himself the truth that had become the foundation of his new beginning. Wealth is not measured by what we keep, but by what we give. In that moment, he knew his journey was not ending, but only beginning. And somewhere in the laughter of a boy named Jamal, he heard the sound of a future brighter than any empire he had ever built.